You're listening to The Scoop on Ultrasound, where the world of ultrasound imaging comes alive through dynamic conversations. This episode is brought to you by EDM Medical Solutions. Be sure to follow the podcast on your favorite app so that you never miss an episode. Today, we're diving into the future of cancer treatment with Dr. Natasha Sheybani, a pioneering biomedical engineer and cancer researcher at the University of Virginia. She is an assistant professor with roles across biomedical engineering, radiology, medical imaging, and neurosurgery, and she leads research at UVA's Focused Ultrasound Cancer Immunotherapy Center. Dr. Sheybani's work focuses on focused ultrasound, a non-invasive technology that not only targets tumors, but also activates the immune system and opens new frontiers in personalized cancer care. Her achievements span Stanford and UVA, Forbes 30 Under 30, Stat News Wunderkinds, and the NIH Director's Early Independence Award. In this episode, we explore how focused ultrasound is reshaping oncology and what this breakthrough means for the future of cancer treatment.
Quality supplies make a difference. At EDM Medical Solutions, we support over 2,000 healthcare facilities across the U.S. with high-quality medical products built for real clinical needs. From ultrasound imaging accessories to surgical instruments and everyday disposables, our portfolio spans women's health, men's health, and the operating room. We've spent over 35 years helping practices deliver safe, efficient, and cost-effective patient care, with the personal support only a family-owned company can provide. Explore our full range of solutions today at us.edm-imaging.com.
Welcome to The Scoop on Ultrasound, the podcast where we spotlight innovation in ultrasound imaging. Today's episode brings us into the frontier of oncology, where focused ultrasound is transforming how we think about cancer care, and we're honored to have a guest who is leading that transformation. Dr. Natasha Sheybani is a biomedical engineer and cancer researcher at the University of Virginia, where she serves as an assistant professor in biomedical engineering with courtesy appointments in radiology and medical imaging and neurosurgery. She is also the research director of UVA's Focused Ultrasound Cancer Immunotherapy Center. Her work centers on a highly disruptive technology, focused ultrasound, which is a non-invasive, non-ionizing platform that delivers targeted energy deep into tumors. Her lab is developing ways to use this technology not just to destroy tumor tissue, but to activate the immune system, enhance drug delivery, and personalize cancer care. Dr. Sheybani's career includes fellowships at Stanford and UVA, and her recognitions span Forbes 30 Under 30, Stat News Wunderkinds, and the NIH Director's Early Independence Award. And Dr. Sheybani, welcome and thank you for joining us on The Scoop on Ultrasound.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with your personal journey into this field. Cancer research today, right, is increasingly interdisciplinary. It brings together imaging, immunology, and engineering, and your own career is a reflection of that interdisciplinary approach, right? What first drew you to the intersection of biomedical engineering and cancer research?
It's a really fabulous question. I started my foray into research actually through neuroscience and biomedical engineering. So my origins were not in cancer research. But I think increasingly, as I learned about the arsenal of tools that we have access to in biomedical engineering in particular, I was sort of drawn to how we can bring these into increasingly complex problems. And of course, one of the most complex problems that humanity faces is the existence of cancer. So it was really at the point, at a juncture where I was entering grad school with a background in drug delivery and biomaterials for other disease indications, where I just serendipitously started to read about this principle of image-guided therapy and image-guided drug delivery. And little did I know at that time that I was converging on several labs and research areas that all related to focused ultrasound. And so I chose to enter that field, but it was also at a time when the advent of immuno-oncology explorations, immunomodulation was really taking flight. And so I was really fortunate to be kind of part of that growth. And that certainly cemented my understanding of the complexities of cancer and my desire to stay in that space. We as engineers love complicated problems and coming up with solutions. So to your point about cross-disciplinary, I think that's kept me in the lab very busy, but also very engaged with a diverse range of collaborators. So
So fascinating to hear how you arrived at that point, right? There's a lot of opportunities when you start in one spot of engineering to end up somewhere where maybe you didn't imagine. So it's always interesting to hear how you got there. Now, for the audience, I think we should take a moment to define what focused ultrasound is, especially those who are in clinical ultrasound who may be more familiar with the diagnostic applications and the imaging component. So, how does focused ultrasound work in cancer treatment? And could you give us an overview of what sets it apart from surgery or radiation?
absolutely. So I will take a step back to acknowledge what you just mentioned, which is a lot of us hear the term ultrasound and we immediately think imaging, right? You project sound waves into the body and receive an image back. Ultrasound is a very unique and exciting modality, and perhaps this is underappreciated in that we can use that same imaging modality and the same energy form for therapy as well. And so that's where focused ultrasound comes in part because there are essentially, these exciting ways that we can tune the physics of the sound waves and even the geometry of our hardware to project those same ultrasound waves into the body in a highly concentrated manner. So you can imagine, I would liken this to maybe a better analogy, which is like taking a magnifying glass out on a hot day and having, beams of light project through the magnifying glass and get focused on the other end. We're essentially doing the same thing here with sound, where our magnifying glass is now an ultrasound transducer. So that's the basic principle of focused ultrasound, which by name is us focusing sound waves into a tiny ellipsoid volume. And these can be very small volumes, like on the order of a grain of rice, for example. And we have the ability to essentially steer those sound waves around in the body and be highly precise in how we're spatially depositing the energy. So, what makes this different from our other mainstays in cancer therapy, like surgery, like radiation? Well, first and foremost, what's exciting about FUS is that it's a completely non-invasive technology. In many cases, our ultrasound transducers are designed to project those sound waves extracorporeally. So practically for a patient, this means no catheter, no incision, no highly invasive procedure. And of course, far fewer risks associated with that. In juxtaposition with radiation, I would add that we're talking about a non-ionizing energy form. So in this sense, it's exciting to think about the opportunities to either complement radiation therapy or add focused ultrasound into the toolkit in a manner that doesn't necessarily incur the same risks or off-target effects that we see with radiation or chemo, for example. And I can add one more thing to that too, which is I love to highlight the fact that we're only limited in what we can do with ultrasound therapy by the physics, of what we can do with a sound wave. So practically speaking, when I'm talking about energy, I'm talking about rendering bioeffects that range anywhere from being thermal to more mechanical in nature. And so this endows focused ultrasound with a particularly broad versatility as a singular tool where there are really all kinds of perturbations that we can make to the tissue with focused ultrasound technology.
Right. With focused ultrasound, really, it seems like, especially in recent years, there's just new applications coming out more and more as the research continues. I'm sure you've seen, and I believe it actually was from UVA, how high intensity focused ultrasound was used on a Parkinson's patient to treat the tremors. And it was a very interesting study that was done there. And he was a great story of how successful it was. So at least initially, right? Because these things have to be evaluated over the long term. But I think what you're saying, it speaks to that, how there's a wide variety of applications. Of course, today we're talking about cancer, but just in a bunch of other diseases and conditions, possibly including neurological ones like Parkinson's.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the most promising aspects of your work, right, is how focused ultrasound can act as a bridge. In other words, it doesn't just destroy the tumors, but it also stimulates the immune system, right? So, how does the technology wake up, if we could say that, wake up the immune system to fight cancer? And what makes that different from other types of cancer immunotherapy?
Yeah, so I'll set all of this up to say that when we think about the scope of cancer immunotherapy and fundamentally where it's limited, there are two places where we love thinking about focused ultrasound as a plug-in. One is for solving the fundamental problem of physical barriers, getting our drugs to where they need to go in sufficient quantity. And the other is, like you said, waking up the immune system, giving it the alerts it needs in order to recognize and respond to our best immunotherapy drugs, which are unfortunately many of which are still failing across a lot of solid tumor contexts. So, with that in mind, the really interesting and complex aspect of thinking about all of this is that the immune system is highly Newtonian, right? You poke one part of the system and another part will sort of react. And so it's within this framework that I want to position my response because the reality is that anything we throw at cancer probably will bear some impact on the immune system, right? So for years, people have already been thinking about this in the context of surgical interventions, chemo, radiation, use of other cancer drugs. And so the idea of inciting immunity and thinking about synergistic combinations with immunotherapy is nothing new. But now the ways that we can do that potentially in a more targeted and precise manner, in a safer manner, in a more flexible manner, I think has really evolved with the advent of focused ultrasound as a tool in immuno-oncology. And so, thinking about those earlier paradigms, we're essentially talking about two different things, right? We have situations in which we can mechanically or thermally perturb tumor tissue to essentially allow drugs to penetrate through those physical barriers that I was talking about. So, examples of this include breaking up tumor stroma, that very dense tumor tissue in order to allow drugs to penetrate better into solid tumors, transiently disrupting vascular barriers, like with blood brain barrier opening procedures and brain tumors, for example. But then the other piece is immunomodulation, which you mentioned. And so, across the board, whether it's with thermal or mechanical stimuli, what we're essentially talking about is trying to fine tune the immune system's response to stress. We can basically induce stress within the immune system in very specific ways that render the tumor somewhat like a beacon to the right flavors of immune cells, where ideally the hope is that by generating that beacon, we are signaling to the immune system that those cells should infiltrate. And ultimately, we want those to be the cells that will synergize with our immunotherapy drugs. And so that's really where the immunomodulation space has taken flight, where we're really studying those fundamental interactions between our thermal or mechanical stimuli and different elements of the immune system.
So let's dive into the work happening in your lab today because there's a lot of exciting things I'm sure being done at your lab. Your research combines multimodal imaging, liquid biopsies, and systems biology. This is some of the most cutting edge work, we must say, right, in the field right now. So could you tell us what, in your opinion, what are some of the most exciting findings coming out of your lab at UVA right now?
I'm very biased, but I think, like we're so excited about so many of the things that we're doing right now. And I have to say that as an assistant professor who feels very fortunate to have been supported by, funding mechanisms early that have allowed us to really like take risks and think big from the outset of starting the lab. So, you mentioned multimodal imaging, you mentioned liquid biopsy. So I'll focus on those as themes here that are united by a couple of key concepts. So, imaging and liquid biopsy, will liken this to a blood draw, are similar in that they are tools that we can use to essentially spatiotemporally monitor the biology that we're trying to manipulate, right? And these are tools that also happen to incur very minimal risk from a safety perspective to patients. It's not necessarily tough to get an image or a blood draw. And so we can also do these things longitudinally, meaning that over time we have access to changing and adapting contexts in cancer. And I'm highlighting all of that really to say that at the forefront of everything we're doing is this consideration to what patients are ultimately going to go through. And one of the biggest challenges in cancer remains are the limitations of how we are able to monitor and adapt our therapies, closer to real time. So this is maybe at the core of what I'm most excited about and what we're doing as a lab these days, because yes, we're tackling these really tough problems in the context of strategic ways to combine focused ultrasound and immunotherapy. But we're coming at that with this additional layer of implementation with tools like theranostic tools, for example, things that allow us to, again, peer inside the body and make assessments of how well the combinations are working. I'm doing that through liquid biopsy by looking at some really cool analytes like extracellular vesicles, which are essentially these nanoparticles that many of the cells inside our body release. And then they essentially carry a lot of biomarker payloads that can be very informative for how cancers are adapting and changing. So these are really a couple of the areas right now that we're exploring deeply. And I think a lot of what we're doing with imaging and liquid biopsy in particular is, again, rooted in the notion that should we be able to monitor more effectively what we are doing while we're doing it, and then ideally identify, some of the biomarkers that are key to either fine tuning or adapting those treatments, then we sort of have set up this really nice cycle for being able to rationally design combinations around different immunotherapies, but then also monitor them as they're being deployed. And as you can imagine, this is a really tall order. So I'm still talking about work that's at the core of many endeavors in cancer, but we're certainly taking to heart the need to bring those considerations into the focused ultrasound field kind of early and effectively. And the last thing I'll add to that is we have the really good fortune here at UVA of having a robust translational pipeline. So we interact closely with multiple clinical trials that are affording us this additional layer of insight as well as access to learnings from the clinic where patients are also undergoing focused ultrasound treatments and various oncologic indications.
Amazing. Now, this kind of research, of course, is thrilling from a scientific standpoint, but at the end of the day, it's about helping real patients, right? And one of the big appeals of focused ultrasound is its potential to reduce systemic toxicity, spare healthy tissue from damage, and really offer new hope for patients who feel like they have limited options, which many do. So, what could this mean for patients facing some of the hardest to treat cancers, for example? And how do you see that impacting access to care?
If you are high-level disinfecting your ultrasound transducer, it's likely you're soaking the probe or using an automated HLD device. But there's a better option out there. TriStel Old can high-level disinfect your transducer in just 2 minutes and costs under $3 per cycle. Sound too good to be true? Request a brochure today and learn why so many practices are switching over to TriStel Old. Visit us.edm-imaging.com/TriStel. That's TRISTEL. And now, back to the show.
Several fabulous questions in there, and I'll try to take them one at a time. So let me know if I miss any themes. But you said something that really resonated, which had to do with dose titration, for example, and the notion of hard to treat cancers. And those two things are very, inextricably linked, right? Our toughest to treat cancers are usually the ones that come with the harshest therapeutic paradigms, for patients. And again, we've talked about this recurrent theme of safety risk, off-target effects, and all of these things that fundamentally make cancer care very burdensome in a lot of cases, and also they can render their own challenges for survivorship as well. I interact very closely with a group of patient advocates who are now working with our lab in breast cancer care specifically. And these are women who have undergone breast cancer care themselves. They fortunately have, the outcome has been great and they are cancer free, but they are not free of the burdens that came along with their cancer care and all that was subsequent to that that they have been dealing with since. So I don't take lightly the fact that even in cases where our cancer care has been successful, we have a ways to go for making it more accessible and less tough on patients. So that is where I see a really ripe opportunity for focused ultrasounds, and it's one that we're exploring fervently in the lab right now, which is whether it's for immunotherapies, like checkpoint inhibitors, CAR T cells, for example, or small molecule therapies. We have been sort of taking to the bench that question of, can we effectively reduce dose, in particular systemic dose of therapy, without compromising efficacy in situations where we know that ultrasound could potentially aid that therapy and its penetrance or its performance through immunomodulatory effects. So you just touched on a really key question for us, and it just so happens to be a question that we're asking in some of the toughest cancers, which include high risk breast cancers, adult and pediatric brain tumors like high grade gliomas, as well as pancreatic cancer more recently. So, in this sense, I would say we are definitely thinking about the types of questions that we hope are nearest and dearest to, people who are still, whether as patients or caregivers, having to deal with the current state of cancer care. But you also asked about accessibility. And I have to say, one of the benefits of working with ultrasound technology is the fact that it lends, let's say, favorably to prospects for portability, for lower cost systems, for adaptable systems. And so from a purely like accessibility angle, I would also say that ultrasound is a very well-positioned technology to be working with as we're trying to tackle all of these other questions.
Right, right. I mean, we see how point of care ultrasound, for example, on the diagnostic side has really improved the access to ultrasound imaging and to imaging as a whole, especially in rural settings where they don't have an imaging suite so easily accessible. So to see that the technology in a very different way, right, is now being used and can promote access just goes to show how what you're saying, that ultrasound technology can be a bridge, especially in communities, even here at home in the US, that really are at a disadvantage and do not have the healthcare infrastructure available to them, yet are in urgent need of care. For sure.
Totally. And I would just add to that, I think therapeutic ultrasound as a field and a domain is very much following in the footsteps of diagnostic ultrasound. The endeavors to make that point of care connection more, realistic and widespread. We're totally seeing it happen in the field.
Right. Now, continuing to talk about where it's heading, since we're already talking about the future, we sort of hinted to it, but cancer care really is increasingly becoming multimodal. And focused ultrasound might not replace surgery or radiation in all cases, but it really could become a critical layer of the therapeutic stack, right? So, where do you see focused ultrasound and immunotherapy heading in, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years? And how do you see them integrating into standard oncology care?
So, I think there are a couple layers to that question, right? I mean, from the standpoint of our mainstays, you're absolutely right. I would not venture to say that focused ultrasound necessarily will or should be a replacement. And certainly, it'd be very cool to see that day. But I could point to virtually every facet of cancer care and identify a very rational role for ultrasound. For example, tumor debulking. This is something we can do with various ablation modalities. Conferring, better penetrance and thereby lower doses of, chemotherapies or other targeted therapies. Absolutely something we can do. And then more recently, we've also seen the advent of radiosensitization approaches with ultrasound, where there are strategies that would enable combination of specific focused ultrasound regimes with ionizing radiation, essentially allowing us to reduce radiation dose. And so these are all really exciting sort of across the board developments. I think that where immunotherapy fits into that is certainly going to be something cancer specific. There are the cancers that are already seeing classical forms of immunotherapy, like checkpoint inhibitors, like move closer and closer to the standard of care. So we can think about opportunities again for really fortifying that paradigm where immunotherapy is already at the table for these patients. And the focus there, I think, should again be on, more precision, less dose, less immune-related toxicities, for example. And then we have, polar opposite of that, the situations where immunotherapies are just fundamentally novel. And so to even bring immuno-oncology paradigms to bear in a robust way in other cancers is going to require us to tackle a different set of problems, whether they're delivery related or again, immune tapestry related. And again, I think that focused ultrasound has some really clear roles to play. And I would highlight, for example, brain tumors as, like an epitome of this, where we have some really, key opportunities such as those for overcoming the blood-brain barrier, where by virtue of bringing online those possibilities robustly, I think that like the option of being able to repurpose certain drugs that failed or bring online very real opportunities to get immunotherapies working, that's seeming more and more real these days. And so there is, across the focused ultrasound field, a lot of work that's being done essentially in tandem to explore all of the possibilities that I just mentioned.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless, right? Especially as the technology evolves, and now we have this whole thing with AI. Well, we've had AI, I should say, right? We see how the acceleration of AI adoption in healthcare is now adding an extra layer, right? Just seeing how there's so many possibilities into integrating that. I'm sure you and your research team are also considering how to integrate such technologies as well, and in the future, if anything, right? So really, it's hard to predict exactly how it will evolve, but I'm certain from what you're saying, we really are going to see how it's going to become part of oncology.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned AI, I've got to say, we all know like we are headed toward, if not already living in that future. And so my message these days to like my own lab and to colleagues in the field is we're in an era where we have the opportunity to be very intentional about how we are deploying studies, the types of data that we're collecting. And in doing so, I think we'll be really well positioned to bring AI and other analytical tools um, online in a strategic way. And the reason we are in need of this, in particular as ultrasound researchers, is think about the complexity of cancer alongside the complexity of the immune system, alongside the complexity of these sound waves that are highly multiparametric and how we can tune them. It is needless to say almost that it is such a multiparametric scenario that we're dealing with, like even just as fuss immuno-oncology researchers, that we can't possibly test every last permutation and possibility. So I totally feel that AI is going to have a major role to play in our field going.
Certainly, certainly. There's no avoiding that. Now, you are at the forefront of research. You are deep in the weeds, right? As a researcher, what message would you share with patients, the families of patients, and even young scientists about the promise of this research that you and your lab?
I would share, I guess for patients and young scientists, I might have kind of two separate messages, right? So for patients, I think more than anything, I just want patients to know that there are researchers out there who care deeply about what patients are going through and who want to do the work to really bring better options to bear and we've talked about what better could be defined as, right? And so for researchers, I think really the promise lies in the fact that we are here exploring a technology that fundamentally holds the promise of, a less invasive, potentially safer avenue for care. And of course, it's something that we are still testing diligently in the lab and in clinical trials. So, that takes time and resources to bring to full realization. But I think that it's increasingly important for us to just let patients know that there are a lot of scenarios in science where we are starting at the clinic and trying to work our way back. And I think that's what's been really central to the way that I run my lab, because we want to be working on problems that we really feel could impact people one day. And that requires understanding the people first, right, and the clinical scenario. For young scientists, I would just add to that, I think bringing that kind of perspective to your science early and also embracing the serendipities and the twists and turns of the scientific journey that come with that, it's critically important. And one of my favorite quotes that I use in all kinds of contexts, but it's relevant here too, is be uncompromising in your vision, but flexible in your path. And so I think scientifically, our vision is very clear when it comes to this intersection of focused ultrasound and immuno-oncology. But our path to getting there has certainly not been prescribed, and it has not been necessarily a straightforward one. But we have tried to keep true to our vision, and we'll continue to as best as possible.
Dr. Sheybani, thank you. Thank you for helping us get a full picture, right, of the state of ultrasound technology, specifically focused ultrasound, right? When ultrasound is not just used to see, but to heal. Your work really does exemplify the future of cancer care. And it's just so great to get so many insights from yourself and the work that your lab is doing. So thank you again for joining us on the Scoop on Ultrasound.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Scoop on Ultrasound. Subscribe today to be notified when new episodes are released, and visit our website, us.edm-imaging.com, to learn more about who we are and what we do.